Pandemics are a serious issue, potentially. You've heard a lot about the coronavirus, and it's serious stuff. Pandemics threaten our ever-shrinking world. You know, in the modern day, feasibly, people could be at a conference in, let's say, Italy, and then spread out to every continent in the world within a day. In this video, I want to talk about pandemics and pandemic preparedness. I want to give you a home pandemic threat assessment. I'm going to give you a document that you can fill out for possible pandemic threats. You'll be able to use that document to teach your family about the threat being faced, the actions you as a family will take in response to that threat, and I'll also kind of go through the Wuhan coronavirus, filling out this form with you, sort of. I'll talk to you a little bit about prepping, buying things that people do in anticipation of an event like this. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit at the end of the video about how the fact that certain countries are going to be more vulnerable to pandemics than others. I think white Western countries are pretty vulnerable, but I think there are some other countries that might surprise you that are in particularly risky situations for future pandemics. First off, this document. Health and pandemics are complicated things. Now, you might be smart, and, you can look into things about the coronavirus and pandemics, and you'll be able to remember a lot and make some reasonable decisions. But if we create a document to really take inventory of our knowledge, we'll really be able to step back and take a calmer approach to things. If we let this document be our source of truth and information on the pandemic, we can update it as more information comes in. If there's ever a time to actually put pen to paper, something serious, let's write it down. Would not pandemics count? I mean, if this doesn't count for, hey, let's put pen to paper, what would? Okay, so this is the home pandemic threat assessment. The reason we're creating a document is because you could spend an endless amount of time seeing videos on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook of some hospital that's overrun in Wuhan. You could hear a story of somebody who got hurt or is suffering from the pandemic. You need to take that nearly endless supply of content and condense it down into actual things that are actionable by your family. No matter how many videos you watch that are disturbing, that doesn't protect your family and that doesn't get you closer to an action plan. So this is why we're filling this out. The very first part of this is really identifying and taking inventory of what we know about the pandemic. So this is not a document that's specific for the current Wuhan coronavirus. This is for any pandemic, current or future. So the very first thing is we got to list all the names that the pathogen is going by. So for instance, I'll write in Wuhan coronavirus for the current pandemic. I'll also write in SARS-CoV-2, which is the more scientific name for the virus. Now, you'll notice that pathogens cause a disease, so the disease will also have a different name. The disease is COVID-19. And the reason I'm putting these at the top of the document is, well, you need to be able to search the different names to come up with all the results we need to understand this to the best of our ability. Type of pathogen, in this case, we're dealing with a virus. I don't have any notes about it right now. Method of transmission, as far as we know, as far as I've read, you can tell me if you've read anything different. Respiratory droplets is probably the major factor. Respiratory droplets are things that come out of people when they cough, sneeze, or talk. About 6 feet, which is about 2 meters, from infected people. I did read that there has been some viral RNA detected in stool. So I'll say stool possible. So for those of you who live in conditions where You might come into contact with open sewage. That's more concern for you. That's just a possible. I'm writing that in because it's a possibility. It's been mentioned. So there's no reason not to err on the side of safety. Can the pathogen be spread by asymptomatic carriers? For now, I'm going to say yes. Hopefully that's not true. So an asymptomatic carrier is someone who's not showing any symptoms being able to spread the pathogen. For the most part, let's say you had a viral infection. Normally that virus starts to really take hold in your body and start to affect you negatively and make you ill before you start to shed the virus. But sometimes that's not the case, and that's when you're asymptomatic. So you haven't gotten ill yet. You're not really showing any signs of sickness, but you are shedding the pathogen. So I'm going to say yes for now. Hopefully I get to change that to no later. Known or suspected animal vectors, bat. And we did hear about that potential case of a dog. I didn't look into that recently. Hopefully that turns out not to be true. Hopefully that was a false positive, but I believe there was one case of a dog that was suspected to have contracted the Wuhan coronavirus in China. I think pangolin was also, I don't know how to spell pangolin, but luckily I don't live in a place where pangolins are something that I could interact with. But it's good to know what sort of animal vectors are possible. Often we think of human to human spreading. We think of, oh, well, I won't go to the big conference with those thousands of people. But if it can be spread by dogs and you bring your dog to the dog park who humps all the other dogs and then goes home and licks your child's face, you need to know this. Does the pathogen typically lead to co-infection? In the case of the Wuhan coronavirus, I'll select yes. And that's because the Wuhan coronavirus is almost always associated, or at least is always associated as far as I know, with a bacterial infection in the lungs, pneumonia. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing pretty much everyone, or as far as I know, everyone who's going into the hospital who is sick and then is being shown to have the coronavirus, they have pneumonia. So the virus is coming in, and then the virus is making them susceptible to a bacterial lung infection, and so they get pneumonia. So that's definitely important to know. Estimated infectivity. Infectivity is the ability to spread between hosts as compared to the seasonal flu, right? So here in the United States, the seasonal flu infects about 30 million Americans during flu season. Flu season is about 13 weeks, late fall to mid to late winter. So just under 10% of the population gets the seasonal flu every year, more or less. I'm going to check both about the same and quicker. I've seen some evidence to suggest it's maybe a little bit quicker or maybe about the same. I'm hoping that as more information comes in, as we get a better view of the infectivity over the coming days, I get to uncheck quicker. That's what I'm hoping for. Are there any external conditions known to inhibit or facilitate spreading of the pathogen? For example, open sewers versus combined sewers versus underground sanitary sewers, right? Combined sewers is where the storm sewers and the sewage is combined into a common pipe. I don't really know of any conditions yet. As time goes on and we start to see, let's say, a significant spread in one country and a not significant spread in another country that has also been exposed, we might start to find out that because of some condition, it's much more likely to spread in certain places than others. And then you can fill some stuff in there. We could speculate on certain things like public transport being popular. So maybe New York City with all of its subways would be more susceptible to spreading it rather than Houston with all the people who drive cars. But for now, I'm going to wait until we actually see some external conditions really make themselves known in the actual infection rates. So I'm just going to say not yet. Are there any internal conditions, internal to the host, known to inhibit or facilitate spreading of the pathogen? Differences between elderly and young, differences between races, heart conditions, previous infections, When I say previous infections, think of cowpox. Cowpox prevented the infection of smallpox back in the day. That was the very first vaccine, is you would purposely get infected with cowpox, so that way you wouldn't get infected with smallpox later. You'd become immune to smallpox. That vaccine means from a cow. So in this case, we're definitely seeing a difference between the elderly and the young. Elderly, much more susceptible, or I don't want to say susceptible, much more likely to die. That's maybe a fairly blunt way to say it, but we are seeing a significantly higher rate of death in the elderly. I don't know if we're seeing actually higher infection rates in the elderly. We just might be seeing higher death rates. Possible difference between races. So the coronavirus, in this case, affects ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2, which is more common in Asians than non-Asians, but it's in everyone's heart, lungs, and kidneys. Asians possibly more at risk. It's not known yet if that's really going to play out into any significant way. It could mean that there's higher infection rates or higher death rates, or both, in some populations than others. Or for right now, that's just a possibility. Heart conditions, no. ACE2 present in heart, lungs, kidneys. So this internal conditions, hopefully you can see how this might be useful to your family. If you can identify internal conditions that might put people more at risk, well, then you can say, well, what sort of these internal conditions do any apply to my family? So if ACE2 is present in the heart, lungs, and kidneys, where the virus is active, then you would want to know who in your family who has a potential heart condition, if they've ever had a heart condition or a cardiac event. Because it's in the lungs and because this causes pneumonia, I'd be much more concerned if you have any smokers in the family. Smokers, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a much higher rate of death among smokers than non-smokers during this pandemic. We'll see how it goes. But we're laying this out because it's useful information for us to make decisions for our family. Sometimes you'll list out conditions that have no effect on your family, and that's just great. That's what you'd prefer. Estimated virulence, so the ability to harm the host as compared to the seasonal flu. Before we estimated the infectivity, the ability to spread, and now we'll estimate the virulence. Now, often something that's more infective is also more virulent, but that's not always the case. In this case, it does seem much more deadly than the seasonal flu. So, for example, here in the United States, about 35,000 Americans die from the flu each flu season. So during that 13-week period, about 0.01% of the population dies, which is about 0.116% of the people who were ill, right? So 0.116 for the people who actually caught the flu. That's what percentage died. If it is more deadly than the seasonal flu, how deadly is it? This is just to really put things into perspective. It's one thing to watch a whole bunch of videos online and get increasingly more scared and alarmed. It's another thing to understand how much the risk actually is. For the coronavirus, I'm going to select both 1 to 3 and 3 to 5. It's somewhere in this 2-ish to 5-ish%. Some of the early numbers showed 5%. Some of the later numbers showed maybe more like 2.5% or something like that. Hopefully I get to uncheck 3 to 5% later. For now, I'll leave this checked. And I threw in a couple examples. Spanish flu was about 2 to 3%, which is, I'm guessing, what the coronavirus might end up being. Ebola is about 50 to 75%. So it's much more virulent, but because it's a lot harder to spread than something like coronavirus. Cholera, when it's treated, is about 0.2 to 1% death. But cholera, when it's not treated, is about 50 to 75% death. And we'll get into treatment in the next section. But I want you to think about that too. That matters too. SARS, which is related or similar in some ways to the coronavirus, is about 10%. So it's kind of like more of these two. And then smallpox, which is for the most part eradicated, except some labs have it around, was about 30%. So on this page, I think this is the last page where we really sort of inventory our knowledge on the disease. For patients who do survive, do they have any permanent or temporary impairments? As far as I know, people who are surviving the coronavirus, which is most people, don't have any impairments when they recover. They have full recoveries. There could be a pandemic in the future. Let's say it's an infection in your eye that could spread to your brain. Even those who survive it may have, let's say, temporary or permanent or both damage to their vision. And you would list that here, but for right now, I'm just going to say none yet. We don't have any evidence of impairments after recovery or even during recovery. What treatments are currently available for the pandemic? As far as I know, none yet for the coronavirus. So I'm just going to write this down, but this is something to keep in mind. This is something you need to know for your decisions in your family. What treatments are currently available? The next one is how effective are the treatments? The next one is how available are those treatments where you live? And what's the trend? Are those treatments becoming more available where you live, less available, or about the same? Oh yeah, there's one more page about the pathogen. So this last page here, it's getting pretty practical at this point. What part of the body does the pathogen affect? We're going to write ACE2 in lungs, heart, kidney. What signs might an infected person show? I hope this is fairly obvious why knowing the signs of an infected person might be helpful to you. So you could potentially avoid an affected person, so you could catch it early in someone in your family. I'm going to select for under lungs, cough, wheezing, and difficulty breathing. And in the notes here, I'm going to write all pneumonia symptoms may be present. So any symptoms of pneumonia could be indicative of coronavirus. The other thing that we see in large amounts with the coronavirus is fever. Pretty much everyone's got a fever. Other sections here include fluid and food intake, people vomiting, inability to drink, inability to eat. We're not seeing any of that with the current coronavirus. Body control, coma, fainting, convulsions, and seizures, changes in urine, changes in stool. We're not necessarily seeing anything right now with the current coronavirus, but with different pandemics, this could change. These could be highly relevant to checking things out. Pain in any location. I don't think we've seen anything of that. Swelling of any location. I don't think we've seen any of that. The changing of color to any part of the body. So I'll throw in a couple possibles for the coronavirus. I'll throw in fainting. Someone experiencing pneumonia may end up with lower than average blood oxygen levels. They may be more susceptible to fainting. And I'll also change color of lips to blue. Anyone with blue lips is generally either suffering severe hypothermia, or is extremely low in blood oxygen content. If you ever see anyone with blue lips, call for help immediately because they're probably going to die. And then I list just another section just in case, there's anything I missed here in signs of an infected person. Okay, now we get to now that we've got a pretty decent understanding, or at least our best guess, because a lot of times your best guess can get you in the ballpark. Once we've taken some time to write things down and to understand it the best we can, A lot of times that gets us close enough. The next part, this miscellaneous risk assessment, the main thing we need to know is, can you stay where you are? I want to get you on to some thought about this. And I don't have anything for you to fill out here because it's all just questions you're going to answer to yourself and then make the decision, can you stay where you are? So, question, do you live in an area that is prone to rioting, violence, or civil unrest during a crisis? And do you believe, based off of how we've described the current pandemic, that the current pandemic could trigger that violence? Just take your best guess. Do you live in an area that has risk factors that may lead to especially high rates of infections, like open sewers? Remember how we talked about external factors? Well, do you live in an area with a lot of external factors? Or do you believe that public systems in place, like water, electricity, and sewer, are highly robust where you live, or that they can't be fully relied on and might break down, be mismanaged, and become unavailable? Are the people near you, like your apartment building, your street, your cul-de-sac, your neighborhood, are they friendly to you? Do they not know you at all? Are they plain straight up unfriendly to you? Do you have feuds with them? Do you live around people of your own race? Something to think about. And if things suddenly got worse, do you have somewhere else to go? And how far away is it? How difficult could it be to get there? Do you just rely on basic roads? Or would you have to take a ferry? A service that might be interrupted during a pandemic. And those roads that you could take, are they potentially very easily crowded, like the roads around San Francisco or Miami? Or are you looking at the roads between Grand Forks and Fargo, North Dakota, which are much less likely to ever be very crowded? Or could the roads you need to rely on become easily damaged or otherwise impassable? Maybe this coronavirus, or maybe this pandemic that you're potentially preparing for, is happening at the same time as the spring melt, where roads around you tend to flood, or during a rainy season, where sometimes certain bridges get washed out. This is something to think about. We're asking all these questions just so you can decide, are you going to stay where you are? Are you going to hunker down? Or are you going to try and make the move to somewhere else? Now, once you've decided whether you're going to stay where you are or you're going to go somewhere else, we're going to call that place home, and then we'll proceed with sort of creating an actionable family plan. So in this last section, it's time to come up with the plan, bringing it home. So given everything we've looked at in the first part, we're looking at the method of transition, we're looking at whether asymptomatic carriers are possible or not, we're looking at all the animal vectors, the infectivity and the virulence. What sort of steps will your family take to reduce the transmission into the home? And what I want you to do is create a list of rules. Now, I give some examples of types of rules. You could have rules about washing hands, washing clothes, washing and sanitizing dishes and eating utensils. You could have a rule about everyone in the home attending a class, even if it's just a class that, mom or dad is holding, about proper hand washing and utensil cleaning. You could have a rule in your house about eating uncooked foods, like lettuce or raw apples. If you don't know who was touching or coughing on those apples, so maybe from now on, depending on how bad this pandemic is looking, any pandemic that you're preparing for, maybe no one eats raw apples. You want to have an apple? You got to bake it. If it's a real serious pandemic, maybe you don't eat anything at all that's not cooked, including salt, pepper, cinnamon. If you want cinnamon on your baked apple, maybe you have to put it on before you cook it or during the cooking. You can't just sprinkle some cinnamon after it's already cooked, because what if the cinnamon itself is contaminated? We don't ingest things that isn't cooked. You could have rules in place regarding what places are off limits, what people might be off limits to visit. You could have rules against what is not allowed to be brought home. You could have rules against sharing items and the types of interactions that family members are allowed to engage in. So now I've listed out some different types of rules here, but what I think would be best is to list out exactly who in the family is expected to comply with each rule, so that there's as little confusion and gray area as possible. Now, you might hear what I'm talking about and think I'm suggesting total lockdown. Okay, not every pathogen requires a complete lockdown. I'm just saying that the rules should be specific enough so we know what's happening. There should be a clear understanding of the rules. For example, a rule could be Dad will not be carpooling to or from work anymore, right? No more carpooling. Remember how I said one rule could be against sharing items? Well, here's a rule against sharing items. Dad can't carpool anymore. Rules regarding what sort of places and people might be off limits. Mom will no longer be attending her book club in person at the bookstore. She will see if her friends would like to do an over-the-phone book club meeting so they can continue the still, intellectual stimulation and fun that comes with the book club without some of the risk of meeting in a public place with all of those strangers coming in and out of the club. Or you could even say, hey, they can have their book club, but it's got to be at one of their houses where they know everyone's clean and it's not just at a store where strangers are coming in and out at all times. You can set these rules more or less strict, depending on if the pandemic is potentially more or less infectious or more or less virulent. Another rule is son will sell his concert tickets. He won't be attending any more music performances. Maybe he can still hang out with some of his friends and listen to music. Maybe they can come over as long as they abide by all the hand washing rules. You just got to set it in a way where there's no confusion. You'll notice in any of these rules, I don't say Dad will try to do this. Try is not a rule, okay? Mom's going to attempt to do this. No, Mom is not going to attend. Dad will not be carpooling. Son will sell his concert tickets. And I wrote this last rule. It's a suggestion, but I think it's a very good suggestion, something you could incorporate into a family health plan, even without an upcoming pandemic. And so the rule is everyone in the house will attend a daily health checkup at 7:30 a.m. before Dad leaves for work. Dad will check blood pressure, heart rate, breaths per minute, blood oxygen levels, and temperature, and keep everyone's measurements in a log, right? Now, that would be a potentially very powerful rule for the current coronavirus. You'll notice, so if someone gets pneumonia or is starting to get pneumonia, obviously temperature is going to be one of the first things we'll notice, and also breaths per minute is going to be noticed very soon. Now, one of the reasons it's nice to have a sort of regular checkup, even if it's a weekly checkup, is so you can set a baseline. So the average adult takes about 12 to 20 breaths per minute, but babies breathe like 40 times a minute. The smaller you are, the faster you breathe. Hummingbirds breathe really fast. But if you come to me during a pandemic and you say, well, my 13-year-old's breathing at, 29 or 31, is that good? Is that bad? I have no idea. My question for you is, how fast do they normally breathe? And if you've never taken any sort of measurement of this, then we don't know, right? If you take a measurement every day, then you're sitting across the table from your kid and your kid seems to be breathing pretty fast. You could have them sit down and you could count it out and you could tell that it's faster than normal. But if it just seems like they're breathing fast and you never took a baseline, then you won't know. So, something to think about. Doesn't have to be mom. Doesn't have to be dad. It could be mom doing this. In the case of the coronavirus, maybe blood pressure you don't need to take. Blood oxygen levels. Blood oxygen levels and breaths per minute is almost similar in looking for pneumonia. sometimes when you get pneumonia, because you're breathing less efficiently, blood oxygen levels will drop, and then your body, to compensate, will get you to breathe faster. So your blood oxygen levels will go back up to normal, but now you're just breathing faster. So it would be pretty easy to just, for the coronavirus, do breaths per minute, because that doesn't require anything other than a clock, right? Or look at your watch. You just count out someone's breaths for 30 seconds on your watch and then multiply by 2, or just count it out for the whole minute. Most people have a thermometer. If you don't have a thermometer, it's definitely worth having. And you could just do breaths per minute and temperature for coronavirus. In a different pandemic, maybe your heart rate will be more important. And what I'm hoping you'll ultimately do is create a list, like a bulleted list of rules that the family will follow, either a handwritten list or a typed up rule set to provide guidance for the family. I want you to list what day it starts on. When are these rules going into effect? And get everyone's signature. And I don't just mean get their signature. I mean get their sign on. Get them to buy into it. Get them to understand and believe that this is something genuinely good for the family and that they should want to uphold. Because the signature, especially for children, but really for anyone, if they don't really believe in it, it's no different than them just clicking OK on terms and conditions that they'll never read, right? So you got to get people to believe in this. If you can't, you're in a rough spot. And the very last thing I put in this is, what might you need, right? Do you have to buy anything? When people think of preparedness, they often think of buying stuff. And that's okay. Sometimes you do need to buy stuff. Right at the top of the list, I put soap. And guess what I bought for the coronavirus? I bought soap. I need more soap on hand if things are going to get potentially more infectious in my neighborhood. But I think a lot of people really overestimate how important buying, especially large quantities of things, are. I think a lot of people think they can buy their way out of pandemics, and also some people just like shopping. Do you really, is that sweet Bowie knife? No, I get it. It's the big Crocodile Dundee knife. It looks great, but is that really going to help you survive the coronavirus? I'm just wondering. I know you're excited to buy some of those things, and when you have the option to either be the ant who acquires things or the grasshopper who waits to the last minute and starves to death, obviously you want to be the ant. And I think a lot of us are ants on the inside. I think thousands of years of evolution in Europe has done that to a lot of us. You got to be the ant. But I want you to think about a lot of stocking up prior to a pandemic, especially of more frivolous things, is not quite as useful, potentially, to a full class making sure everyone understands the proper hand washing technique, or a rule that everyone must keep their nails trimmed very tightly. You might have some people who like to have longer nails in the family, but if it's a very bad pandemic, keeping short nails is very useful. And keeping short nails might be a lot more useful than, I don't know, some, MREs you bought. Just a thought. So I listed soap number 1 because I think it's number 1. Hand sanitizer gets a lot of publicity. People are big on hand sanitizer nowadays. It generally doesn't do any better of a job than soap. That being said, if you are going to get some hand sanitizer, get it 60% alcohol or higher. The best thing about hand sanitizer is you can use it when there's no water around, and you kind of need water for soap, right? So I have bought hand sanitizer, and it is in my house, but I wouldn't use it in my house as long as I have water to use with my soap. The only reason I would buy really large containers of hand sanitizer is to refill smaller containers, right? You have a small container of hand sanitizer that you carry around with you, and you can use that when there's no water and soap around. Other things you might want are bleach, potable water, which is water you can drink, foods, I think for a lot of people, food's like number 1 on their list rather than soap.
and bleach. Food should not be super high on your list, unless, of course, you have nursing women, pregnant women, anyone who's malnourished, maybe or underweight. Let's say someone who has had an eating disorder. I mean, they need to eat more than your average person. I mean, your average person could probably stop eating for a while. But, food's good, especially for certain people. It's absolutely required. For a lot of people, it's not a big deal to go with a little bit of food. I'm just like, food's needed, but for some people, it's number one on their list when maybe soap and bleach should be number one. Diapers, formula, other child supplies. Even if you're breastfeeding, having a little bit of formula on hand just in case of an emergency, not a bad idea. Batteries, cash on hand, fuel for vehicles or generators. And then some of the things I talked about for health monitoring: thermometer, oximeter, that tests your blood oxygen levels. You can get one that sort of clips onto your finger. A pulse meter, and you can actually get these combined into one device: pulse oximeter and a sphygmomanometer. That's the blood pressure tester. Other medical devices anyone in the family might need. Let's say you have a diabetic who has a glucometer. Make sure you have plenty of those extra glucose test strips, and they have plenty of their medications: metformin, insulin, that kind of stuff. And then anything else listed. Go ahead, just put it in the bottom here. And I thought it would be important to put a date on this. Like I said, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to just go out and start buying tons of stuff. And I think a lot of people do that. But if you do decide that, hey, we need some things, and you take the time to list them out here, don't just say, we really sure do need soap and bleach, and then not put a timeline on it and never go get it. I mean, pick a day to go have it by, and do your best to satisfy it, right? Get the bleach by that day. Get the soap by that day. Get all that water by that day. You can always fill up your tub with water too, by the way. And there's also devices you can get, like big it's like a big balloon you stick in your tub and fill with water to keep it not contaminated. But filling up tubs with water is a very common way throughout the decades to get large amounts of water in your house while the water is still safe, right? If there's any concerns about, is the water going to be safe, just fill up your tub. And even if the water is never not safe, having just some water around for hand washing, if the water got turned off for any reason, and if the water gets turned off and you have a tub full of water, even if you have tons and tons of water for drinking, like bottled water, having a tub full of water still allows you to flush the toilet if the water gets turned off. Just a thought. So there you go. I'm hoping you can use this document, or a document like this, create something like this, to take this endless stream of videos online that are scaring you potentially, and turn it into an actual finite plan for the family. Okay, we're not going to go to concerts, we're not going to go to the restaurants, and we're going to cook all our food, and we're going to wash our hands. It doesn't have to necessarily be a huge lockdown rule set where no one does anything, but depending on the virus, depending on the pandemic that's upcoming, you might put in more significant rules. Maybe you pull the kids out of public school and instruct them from home. Or maybe, depending on how bad this page turned out, the miscellaneous risk assessment, maybe you have to leave town because it's too prone to violence, rioting, and other civil unrest during crises, especially during a very bad pandemic.
And this last note I wanted to touch on was who these pandemics could hit especially hard in the world. For one, I think white Western countries could be hit pretty hard. There's been a lot of screaming about how any white country that closes its border or puts a travel restriction in place to protect themselves is racist or bad. The World Health Organization was very quick to speak out against any first world country putting travel restrictions in place. You might remember Jewish Senator Chuck Schumer talking about Trump's war on immigrants, closing the border. Meanwhile, Israel has no problem putting these kinds of restrictions in place. Looks like only certain types of people aren't allowed to protect themselves. And you have to admit, a lot of white Western countries are very interconnected with each other and the rest of the world economically. And that brings us to our next group of countries. There's another type of country that I think is at major risk for future pandemics. A lot of island nations who have gotten to the point where their entire economy is basically totally tourism focused. And they rely on monthly, weekly, or even daily food shipments just to feed the population. Now, what's going to happen during pandemics, especially if there's a very virulent, very infectious disease out there? Maybe tourists will be too scared to travel to their nation. Or maybe there will be an outcry from the people on their island saying, hey, you got to close the borders to protect us. But a lot of these countries' governments haven't used the taxes the tourists have paid to build up some sort of big war chest so they can run off that, savings in the hard time. Many of these governments live paycheck to paycheck. And if they haven't built up a local fishing industry that could at least potentially feed their population, things could get tough. A lot of these islands might have some old timers who remember some of the old traditional ways of getting food. When they were younger, they had that sharp vision to spot the local edible sea sponges or whatever. But some of those old traditional ways are lost technologies to the younger generations. They might be in a real tough spot. The countries that can fare the best through these trying times may be the countries that are most effectively able to isolate themselves without it meaning major hardship. Quarantines work. Quarantine is just a type of isolation. These pandemics rely on high levels of uncontrolled interaction between hosts. That's us, the people. And some countries will be much more willing and more able to institute controls that isolate their own country's citizens from other countries' citizens. You might remember Russia closed its border to China back in January. And as far as I know, Russia looks like it's suffering coronavirus much less than places like Iran. But Iran's much further from China. They don't share a border with China like Russia does. And I believe Turkey and Armenia closed its borders to Iran, and so they haven't seen any cases yet, even though their neighbor is seeing a lot. It looks like some countries will be more able and willing to do what needs to be done. Stay safe, everybody.